In the spring of 2024, 26-year-old Nora Calloway knew a secret about the wooded West Virginia farm she ran, a secret fed by a deep, reliable spring her family had stewarded for generations. And she knew that the technology giant buying the adjacent property was about to learn that secret the hard way. The first sign of them was not the sound of machinery, but the silent, sterile perfection of a surveyor's stake driven into the earth just beyond her fence line. It was a slender, almost apologetic piece of wood, flagged with a vibrant, unnatural pink that clashed with the deep greens and loamy browns of the Appalachian hillside. To Nora, it looked less like a marker and more like a wound. Let me tell you about the Calloway farm. It wasn't a farm in the conventional sense. Not anymore. There were no vast tilled fields of corn or soybeans. The days of her great-grandfather's cattle were long past. It was what the county tax assessors called unimproved woodland, 150 acres of hickory, oak, and maple that climbed the spine of a long, sleeping ridge. But her grandfather, a man who spoke of the land as if it were a living relative, had taught her its true name. He called it a recharge farm. The forest was the skin, the soil was the muscle, and the deep, fractured bedrock was the bone. Its purpose was not to produce crops you could sell at market, but to gather, filter, and hold the one thing that mattered more than any other: water. At the heart of it all, nestled in a hollow and encased in a stone spring house his own hands had built, was the Calloway Spring. It was the farm's entire reason for being. Now, let me explain about this spring. It was not some babbling brook or a seasonal seep that dried up when the August sun beat down. This was different. The water that emerged from the cool, dark mouth of the spring house was ancient. It was groundwater, deep groundwater, that had percolated for decades through 1,000 feet of sandstone and shale, filtering through a labyrinthine network of fractures before pooling in a vast, subterranean reservoir that only the Calloway land seemed to know how to tap. My grandfather had a way of describing it. He'd say, "Nora, most folks are content to drink the rain. They put down a shallow well, and they drink what fell last Tuesday. We drink the water that remembers the world before we were born." He had journals, thick, leather-bound ledgers filled with his spidery, elegant script, detailing the flow rate every single month for 60 years. Through droughts that turned neighboring creeks to dust, through deluges that turned valleys into lakes, the Calloway Spring remained stubbornly, miraculously consistent. It was a geological anomaly, a quiet miracle of hydrology that the outside world had simply never noticed. The outside world arrived in the form of NexusCorp. They came with press releases and promises, a tidal wave of corporate optimism that washed over the small, hollowed-out towns of the county. They were building an AI data center, a temple to the new digital age, right here, on the 1,000-acre plot that had once been the old Miller logging tract next to Nora's farm. They promised jobs. They promised revitalized infrastructure. They promised a future so bright it was blinding. The local politicians fell over themselves to offer tax breaks. The local papers wrote breathless editorials. To most, the arrival of the gleaming, futuristic facility was a kind of salvation. To Nora, it was a storm gathering on the horizon, a storm she could feel in the very ground beneath her feet. She knew what facilities like that consumed. They didn't just consume electricity, they consumed water. They were thirsty beasts, needing millions of gallons not for people, but for cooling the acres of humming, ravenous servers that were their reason for being. And so, one Tuesday morning, Nora put on her cleanest pair of jeans, pulled her work boots on, and drove her old, mud-splattered truck down the winding gravel road of her driveway and over to the temporary construction offices. They were sterile white trailers, humming with the artificial chill of air conditioning, set down on a patch of raw red clay that had been scraped clean of all life. She walked into the main office, and the world changed. The air was dry and smelled of new carpet and toner. Men in crisp, tailored suits and shirts, too white for this part of the country, looked up from their laptops. They had the smooth, untroubled faces of people who believed every problem had a technological solution. A young woman with a tablet and a professionally welcoming smile intercepted her. "Can I help you?" she asked, her eyes flicking over Nora's worn flannel shirt and the trace of soil under her fingernails. "I need to speak with whoever is in charge of the site," Nora said. Her voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. She was eventually led to a man named Mr. Thornton. He was the gatekeeper antagonist, the physical embodiment of the corporation's polite, dismissive arrogance. He was a man in his late 40s, with perfectly coiffed hair and a suit that probably cost more than her truck. He didn't rise from his chair when she entered his small private office. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk with a pen. "I'm told you have a concern," he said, his tone suggesting the concern was hers, not his. Nora sat, but she didn't relax. She kept her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. "I'm Nora Calloway," she began. "I own the property to the east, the old Calloway farm." "Right," Mr. Thornton said, a flicker of recognition in his eyes. He tapped his pen on a large blueprint spread across his desk, a map of their glorious future. "The woodland parcel. We have a file. You're our neighbor." He said the word neighbor as if it were a quaint, archaic term he had read about in a book. "Your plans require a great deal of water for cooling," Nora stated. It wasn't a question. A thin, self-satisfied smile played on his lips. "They do. Our projections are significant, but our engineering team is the best in the world. We've done extensive geological surveys." He tapped the blueprint again. "We've identified several optimal locations for high-capacity wells right here on our property. It's all been modeled. It's all been solved." Here it was. The moment of truth. Nora took a slow breath, smelling the stale, refrigerated air. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice dropping a little, gaining the weight of her family's history. "I've lived on that land my entire life. My father lived on it before me, and his father before him. Those surveys you paid for, they tell you about the rock. They don't tell you about the water. There is no significant, accessible groundwater on your side of the ridge. Not at any depth the surface well can reach. The water table here is shallow, it's seasonal, and it cannot support what you're planning to build." The silence that followed was thick with condescension. Mr. Thornton leaned back in his chair, the smile now fully formed. It was a pitying smile, the kind a parent gives a child who doesn't understand the complexities of the adult world. "Miss Calloway," he said, his voice dripping with patient indulgence, "I appreciate your local knowledge. It's charming. But with all due respect, we have PhDs from Stanford and MIT on our team. We have ground-penetrating radar. We have seismic data. We have computer models that have run 1 million simulations. I think we have a slightly more sophisticated understanding of the hydrology than local folklore. My grandfather logged the rainfall and the spring's output every day for 60 years, Nora replied, her gaze steady. That's not folklore. That's data. He chuckled. It was a soft, dismissive sound. I'm sure he did. And I'm sure it's a lovely family heirloom. But we're operating on a slightly different scale. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a conference call with our investors in 5 minutes. He stood up, a clear signal that the meeting was over. He had dismissed her, a simple country girl with her charming little stories. He walked her to the door of the trailer, a gesture of magnanimous finality. Don't you worry about the water, Miss Calloway, he said, placing a hand briefly on her shoulder. We'll be just fine. As Nora walked back to her truck, the dust of the construction site coating her boots, she didn't feel angry. She felt a profound and heavy certainty. He was wrong. It was a declarative fact, as solid as the bedrock beneath her feet. They had come with all their money and all their cleverness, and they believed they could command the earth to bend to their will. They believed knowledge came from computer screens and paid consultants. They had no respect. And the land, she knew, the land would remember that. Let me stop and ask you something. Have you ever held a truth so firmly in your hands that it felt like a physical object, while the entire world around you insisted it was empty air? That is where Nora Calloway lived for the next 8 months. She returned to her farm, to the quiet rhythms of her life. She tended the small garden that fed her. She walked the woods. She checked the spring house. From her ridge, she could hear the sounds of NexusCorp's ambition, the distant roar of bulldozers, the percussive clang of steel on steel, and then a new sound. The high-pitched, grinding whine of a drilling rig. They started drilling their first well in May. It was on the western edge of their property, a spot their models had promised was a sure thing. Nora watched the tall derrick rise above the tree line like a skeletal finger pointing at the sky. The grinding went on for weeks. It was a sound that set her teeth on edge, a violation of the deep quiet she was used to. Then, one day, the sound stopped. A week later, the rig was moved to a new location, a few hundred yards to the north. The rumors started to trickle through town. The first well was a bust. They'd hit a pocket of water, but it was a shallow, unreliable lens that would be dry by midsummer. It was, the engineers told the town manager, a minor, expected setback. They drilled the second well, and the third. Each time, the process repeated. The initial optimism, the weeks of grinding, the sudden silence, and the quiet, almost shame-faced relocation of the rig. The men from NexusCorp became a little less visible in the local diner. Their smiles were a little tighter. Mr. Thornton's sleek sedan was seen racing to and from the site with increasing frequency. The land was not cooperating. It refused to yield to their demands to conform to their beautiful, expensive models. The soil was a liar, the bedrock a cheat. It was giving them nothing but dust and damp sand. Now, let me tell you about Nora's grandfather, Joseph Calloway. He was a man made of hickory and quiet conviction. He'd inherited the farm after the Second World War, when it was still a struggling cattle operation. But he was an observer, a listener. He saw how the cattle compacted the soil, how the open pastures bled sediment into the creeks every time it rained. He saw the way the land was gasping. So he did something that made him a laughingstock in the county. He sold the herd. He let the pastures go fallow. He planted trees, thousands of them. A farmer's job isn't to take from the land, he used to tell a young Nora as they'd checked the spring house together. It's to help the land do its job. And this land's job is to hold water. Everything else is just commentary. He was the one who had built the stone spring house, quarrying the rock from an outcrop on the ridge himself. Inside, it was always cool, even on the hottest day of summer. The air smelled of damp stone and ozone. He had a whole philosophy, which he called the law of the spring. It had only 3 rules. Rule 1, you only take what you need. Rule 2, you give back more than you take. For him, giving back meant planting trees, preventing erosion, being a steward. Rule 3, never, ever go into debt to the land or to the bank. Debt, he'd said, is a promise you make to a stranger about a future you can't control. A spring is a promise the earth makes to you about a past you can trust. It was during the great drought of '88 that his wisdom was first vindicated. The whole state was baked dry. Wells failed. Crops withered. The town's reservoir shrank to a muddy puddle. But the Callaway spring flowed on, cool and clear and constant. Joseph didn't hoard it. He ran a simple garden hose from the spring house all the way down to the main road, a quarter of a mile, and put up a small, hand-painted sign that just said, "Water." People came from 3 counties away with jugs and barrels. He never charged a penny. That was giving back. That was the law of the spring. Nora had a moment of private doubt, one evening in late September. The data center was nearly complete, a vast, windowless monolith of concrete and steel that gleamed under a full moon. It was beautiful in a terrifying alien way. It hummed with the latent power of 1,000,000 sleeping computers. Her own farmhouse, nestled in the trees, seemed so small, so fragile, so irrelevant. The whispers in town were getting louder. The NexusCorp people were trying to negotiate with the municipal water authority, trying to run a pipeline from the town reservoir 10 miles away. It was a desperate, fantastically expensive idea. But maybe they'd do it. Maybe their bottomless pit of money would win after all. For a fleeting moment, she wondered if she should have just sold them the farm. She could be living in a nice house somewhere, free of this burden, this ancestral weight. The thought was a sour taste in her mouth. She went into the house and pulled one of her grandfather's journals from the shelf. It was the one from 1988, the year of the drought. She opened it to a random page. His handwriting was as steady as the spring itself. August 14th, it read, "Flow rate, unchanged. Mr. Henderson from down the valley came by today. His well has been dry for a month. Said I was a fool for planting trees all those years ago. Today he called me a miracle worker. I am neither. I am just a man who listened. The land spoke, and I listened." Nora closed the journal. The doubt was gone, burned away by the simple clarity of her grandfather's words. She was not a fool. She was a listener. And the land was about to speak again, this time in a voice the whole world would hear. The 4th well was NexusCorp's last, desperate gamble. They brought in a new team, a new rig, one capable of drilling deeper, faster. They drilled for 2 solid months, straight through October and into the chill of November. They went down 1,000 feet, 2,000, 2,500. The cost was astronomical, and they found nothing. Just mile after mile of dry, stubborn, unforgiving rock. The day they pulled that final drill bit out of the ground, empty, was the day the billion-dollar project died. They just didn't know it yet. The final blow came not from a geologist, but from an accountant. The plan to pipe water from the municipal system was deemed financially and logistically unfeasible. The permits alone would take years, and the cost would be another $100 million. The engineers, the PhDs, from Stanford and MIT, finally had to admit the truth that a 26-year-old woman had told them in a trailer 8 months prior. Their models were wrong. Their technology had failed. Their ground-penetrating radar had shown them rock, but it couldn't show them the absence of water. They had built a digital Valhalla in the middle of a desert they had created themselves. The news, when it finally broke, was a quiet bombshell. The NexusCorp AI data center, the symbol of the region's bright new future, was on indefinite hold. The official reason given was unforeseen hydrological challenges. About a week after the announcement, Nora was in the spring house, cleaning the old copper fittings, just as her grandfather had taught her. She heard the sound of a car coming up her driveway, a sound too smooth and quiet for a pickup truck. She stepped out into the cool afternoon light and saw it, the sleek, black sedan. Mr. Thornton got out. His suit was just as crisp, but he wore it differently now. It was like armor he was no longer sure would protect him. His expensive leather shoes crunched on her gravel. He looked up at the ridge, at the thick, ancient forest, and then he looked at her. The arrogance was gone from his eyes. In its place was something she recognized, the hollowed-out look of a man who has been profoundly and publicly humbled. He walked up to her, stopping a respectful 10 feet away. He looked at the stone spring house, then back at her. "Miss Calloway," he said. His voice was flat. "Mr. Thornton," she replied, her own voice calm. She did not offer him a seat. She did not invite him in. She waited. He cleared his throat. We've run into some unforeseen hydrological challenges." Nora just looked at him. She let the silence stretch, let the weight of his words hang in the air between them. "The thing is," he finally continued, a crack appearing in his corporate facade, "they weren't unforeseen. Not by you." He took a step closer. "How?" he asked. It was a genuine question, stripped of all pretense. "How did you know? All our data, all our science, it all pointed the other way. How did you know?" Nora thought of her grandfather. She thought of the journals, of the 60 years of patient observation, of the law of the spring. "You had data," she said quietly. "My family has knowledge. It's not the same thing. You read maps of the land. We listen to it." He stood there for a long moment, the man from the future staring at the woman from the past. Then he did something she never expected. He nodded, a slow, deliberate gesture of defeat and, perhaps, of respect. "We need your water," he said, the words costing him everything. "The facility is useless without it. We will pay you anything you ask. Name your price." And here, at the moment of her ultimate triumph, Nora did not think about money. She thought about her grandfather's third rule, never go into debt. She thought about his second, give back more than you take. She was in the position of absolute strength, holding the fate of $1 billion investment in her hands, and she was going to use that strength not for herself, but for the land. "It's not for sale," she said. Thornton looked stunned. "I don't understand." "The water is not for sale," she repeated. "The land is not for sale. My grandfather's legacy is not for sale. But I will consider leasing a limited, sustainable right of use, under my terms." The negotiation that followed was not a negotiation at all. It was a dictation. Nora sat him down at her worn kitchen table, the same table where she'd shelled beans with her grandmother, and she laid out her terms. She didn't have a lawyer. She had her grandfather's journals and a moral compass as true as the North Star. First, NexusCorp would fund, in perpetuity, a conservation trust for the entire watershed, protecting it from any future development. Second, they would pay to reforest the 1,000 acres they had scraped bare, using only native species, a project to be managed by her. Third, all water piped from her spring would be on a closed-loop system. Every gallon they took for cooling had to be returned to the aquifer, cooled and cleaned, to ensure the spring's level never dropped. This was technologically difficult and fantastically expensive. Mr. Thornton's face went pale when he heard it. Nora didn't flinch. And fourth, the final term. She would only agree to supply them with enough water to run 40% of their facility. No more. Not ever. But that's impossible," Thornton stammered. "We can't be profitable at 40% capacity. Our investors." "That sounds like a you problem, Mr. Thornton," Nora said, her voice as cool and unyielding as the stone of the spring house. "You built a thirsty beast in a dry land because you didn't listen. Now the beast will go thirsty. Those are the terms. Take them or leave them. The spring doesn't care either way." He took them. Of course, he took them. He had no choice. Now, years later, if you drive through that part of West Virginia, you will see two monuments standing side by side. One is the NexusCorp data center, a gleaming, futuristic edifice that runs at less than half its capacity, a billion-dollar testament to the folly of arrogance. The locals call it Thornton's Thirsty Castle. It hums along, a constant, quiet reminder that money cannot command the rain. The other monument is the Callaway Farm. It looks much the same as it always has, a swath of deep, protected green. But it is bigger now. With the funds from the water lease, Nora, a quiet master of her domain, has bought up adjacent tracts of woodland, placing them all into the conservation trust her terms created. She has become the very thing her grandfather was, a steward, a listener. She is helping the land do its job. The men in their sterile offices had looked at a map and seen a resource to be extracted. They saw water as a line item on a budget, a problem to be solved with technology and capital. They believed knowledge was something you could buy. Nora Callaway, standing on the shoulders of her grandfather, knew the truth. She knew that water was not a resource, but a responsibility. She knew that knowledge was not bought, but earned through generations of patient observation and a deep, abiding respect for the place you call home. They came with their bulldozers and their PhDs to conquer a piece of the earth, and they were turned back by a 26-year-old woman who understood the law of the spring. The land spoke, and in the end, she made them listen.